about the fourth sonata in E-flat major, opus 7, one of the things we usually encounter first is that it is said that it is the second longest sonata in the cycle after the Hammerklavier. To which I would say two things. First, that depends on the tempo, and possibly it is not the second longest, but maybe the third longest or the fourth longest. But whether this way or another, it really doesn't matter, because I would say this is damning with faint praise, as if there's nothing else to say about this sonata. In my opinion, it is one of the greatest works of young Beethoven, and of course I can't prove it, but I feel that if he had not written anything else after this sonata, after the first four sonatas, this sonata number 4 would be known for us as one of the greatest works of piano literature from the classical period. It is just the fact that it is an early work by Beethoven and it is overshadowed by so many incredible masterpieces later on in the cycle that perhaps it is less known than it should be. The length perhaps comes from the fact that it is an incredibly rich sonata. It is symphonic in scope. Like the first three sonatas, it has 4 movements, but for me there's a definite change, a kind of evolution from the first 3 sonatas to this one. Just 1 year separates the first sonatas and this one. It was composed in 1796 and published in 1797. But for me, there is a definite sense of things getting deeper, broader, somehow acquiring almost like a third dimension, as if what previously was a picture on the page comes more to life. It is hard to explain in words, but it is something which I feel very strongly when working on the sonata and performing it. There is some kind of extra level, extra dimension to the music. Looking at the first movement, what strikes me most is 2 things. First, the great abundance of melodies, sections, ideas in the exposition. Not at all one and second melody, first subject, second subject juxtaposed, but one section after another, some kind of generosity of melodic invention. And the second thing is the unstoppable energy, life pulsing in every note. It is so tangible, it is so infectious that it makes it a real pleasure both to play and I hope to listen to. The question of tempo is crucial to this point because this feeling of life will depend quite a bit on what tempo we choose for the first movement. So he writes very clearly, allegro molto e con brio, very fast and with elan, with life inside the music. And yet quite often we encounter this sonata being played at a more stately tempo, which is still beautiful and it's a very musical tempo, but I would argue that to really bring the core of the music out, we need something more risky, with more drive, basically faster. So I would treat these notes not as the basic pulse, but I would treat this as the basic pulse. And these notes, it is almost as if we have a long note and then a pulsation coming out of it, which means not to take these notes as our smallest units of measurement, but rather go from the bottom note and take the chords as what dictates the tempo. So something like this. Which means, of course, some passages later on will be extremely virtuosic. But we know that Beethoven was considered one of the, if not the greatest pianists of that time. And him being a virtuoso, in fact, preceded his being a great composer or a known composer. So the fact that some of the passages become really difficult is not in itself a reason not to take a tempo like that. And in my opinion, this feeling of life which we get through this faster tempo is really worth it. The idea of a long note and then pulsation coming out of it will be something which he explores later on in the movement. Immediately after that, so we have these long notes, like it could be horns, it could be whatever instrument you imagine that has a long and golden tone. So all the rest is surrounded by this glow of the long note, first in the bottom at the beginning, and here in the middle. And if you allow me to jump a little bit further ahead, the final section of the exposition has a kind of shimmering tremolo in the right hand. So we have a melody and a second voice of the melody, all locked in this tremolo, but the left hand is doing once again these long notes. And here, because there's nothing else in the left hand, the effect is really clear and striking. And of course the fact that these long notes come every time on the weak beat, so it's not, but they come on the second beat to make sure that all attention is on them. It is really striking. And this idea, which we'll encounter all throughout Beethoven's works, that when he introduces a motive, and a motive could be a melody, a key, or even an idea, like in this case, of a long note which permeates and which surrounds the music, then he will develop it. He doesn't just plant a seed and then abandon it. If he starts with an idea, like here in the beginning, it is more likely than not that we will encounter this idea later on in the movement. But I jumped from the beginning to the end of the exposition. We have plenty more sections in between. So after this opening, we have a series of passages going up and down. And now something dramatic, fortissimo, and a pianissimo reply here. Contrasts, another thing which Beethoven loves. Here they are good-natured, they are not really dramatic. Or if there is drama, it is a humorous kind of drama, so we don't feel scared. But still there's something so wonderful and full of life in this reply. And again, this insistent. A relaxed reply here. And yet another section full of life and jumps, and the jumps also in the left hand. So once again, this idea of an accent on the offbeat to make sure it really catches our attention. And because it is also a slightly dissonant note, not a harsh dissonance, but still it's not a note belonging to the main chord of F major here. It's like a little bit of a curious question mark. Really? This wonderful staccato full of life here, and quite treacherous jumps in the right hand. The left hand had it easy. whereas the right hand has to do this. You probably might remember this is the highest note which Beethoven had, which actually would have made this jump a bit easier. It is a little bit like jumping from here to the highest note. Because we have the edge there, it is easier to make the jump work. There is nowhere to go beyond that note, so you just throw your hand more or less towards the edge of the keyboard. But in our keyboards, where we have plenty more notes above it, we have to be quite careful not to overshoot. A little inside trick of what we pianists do for this kind of jumps. First, looking at the note before jumping at it makes it more likely that we will hit it. But another thing, we often think of the shortest distance between 2 points being a direct line, a straight line. But when playing, actually, if you have to move your hand very quickly from point A to point B, a straight line is not the shortest way. Because of the way this joint functions, if we do it in a small arc, so lifting it a little bit above the keyboard, it will have less resistance in the elbow, which means faster. You can try it at home. Just try to move your right hand flat on the surface from left to right, and you will probably feel a resistance here just above the elbow. This is the way the joint functions. And if you do it with a small arch, you'll feel that there is no resistance. It's much easier to move the hand. So that's a small trick of how this kind of jumps can be managed in a very fast tempo. And the left hand, like a happy bassoon, just jumps around the place. It's quite melodic as well. And it's wonderful together. And now, after having had already 4 or 5 different sections / melodies, we come to what is probably our second subject. So if you think normally in a sonata would have a subject, a melody, then some kind of connecting episode, and a second subject, usually contrasting. So here indeed we have something contrasting, because everything before that was pulsing and very energetic. And this. And finally we have something which is a bit more relaxed. But instead of coming here after a short connecting passage after the first melody, we had a whole load of melodies before that. As I mentioned, this wonderful generosity, abundance of melodic material. As if he has one idea after another and he doesn't want to discard them, he just writes them one after another and he changes them in this wonderful interconnected network of musical life. Then the second time it's repeated, we once again get this pulsation. So we are just granted 5-6 bars of calm. And immediately, so it is as if we have to split it into 2 different people. Half of us still plays the calm, but above it or below it, as the case may be, there's once again this element of life and energy. And now in the left hand. And now the energetic part once again takes over. So calm was very, very short-lived. Once again, jumps in the left hand, the very same thing which I just described for those. So looking to the note and also lifting the arm slightly helps navigate this very tricky place. And now we have a little bit of drama. Where will this go? He goes to an unexpected key, C major, from E flat major to C major. It's quite a color change. And from fortissimo immediately to pianissimo, so the biggest contrast you can imagine. Once again, a little bit of calm. So you can see how he navigates this contrast, building up expectations, then upsetting these expectations for dramatic, theatrical, humorous effect. It really works wonderfully. Then the same thing in the left hand, while the right hand does this passage in octaves. It is really difficult on modern pianos. We have to play octaves legato in fast tempo and softly. In the time of Beethoven, on Beethoven's pianos, it would have been quite a bit easier because the keys were a lot shallower and lighter, so you could slide much more easily. Whereas here on our pianos, we just have to manage. It cannot sound forced, it cannot sound loud, it should be just elegant and of course, the legato end will be done by the upper voice. So the lower voice is mostly played by the thumb, because what catches our ear the most is the upper voice, so it's important that that's where the legato is. And now what looks like we're going towards the end. There's a lot more to go. Now he does a build-up towards the end of the exposition. So we're back into pulsation territory. One bar piano and a crescendo to a fortissimo. So big eruption of almost orchestral sound. Now, what was before just 8 notes, now will be fortissimo in 16 notes. The question of whether this is pianistic writing or orchestral writing is interesting. I was thinking about that when preparing for this video. On one hand, it is pianistic from the point of view that it sits very comfortably in the hand and it shows off the pianist in a very favorable light, because you can do all these very impressive things. At the same time, I think the thinking behind the writing, even if the writing itself is indeed pianistic, but the imagination behind the writing, for me, it is orchestral. It is, these could be tremolos in two sections of strings, violins and violas, or first and second violins, supported by bassoons maybe. So, hard to say, some kind of interesting hybrid. Perhaps one could think of a concerto for piano and orchestra, or something on the border between pianistic writing and orchestral thinking. That's a point that I will come back to in the second movement. But after this build-up, again, this big passage going towards a fortissimo. Yet this is not the end. Here we have our tremolo section, which I showed in the beginning. You might remember when we spoke about the idea of the long note permeating the music. This I find wonderful, that after a big energetic climax, it gives us something completely different and atmospheric. There's a lot of color and imagination here in these slightly, I wouldn't say minor key, but this. There's some kind of color which we didn't have before, something a little bit more dark, less full of sunshine, I would say, as compared to this music. which is so bright and so open. Here we have something maybe a little bit more clouded. And I would support this by playing this section with a lot of pedal to make sure we have this kind of atmospheric sound coming from the piano. So not so technical, but more treat this like a big block of sound. And then after he repeats it the second time, we have what is indeed the end. So even there he writes another little small section. And then the exposition is repeated. So after we experienced all these sections, he says, well, let's experience them again. The repeat of the exposition was absolutely standard and common at the time. And here, just because of the length of the exposition, it does mean that it enlarges the entire movement by a lot. To balance it out, the development is really short. It is just a page and a half. It is very segmented. It is not really one idea which he pursues. It's more almost cadenza-like in this idea of let's do a little bit of this, let's do a little bit of that. And after one page, we are back to the reprise. After the reprise, however, also to balance the structure, so we have exposition, very short development, reprise, the full length of the exposition, and now to balance it, he writes also a coda. So the end of the reprise here, instead of going, we get a surprise. Now he brings back the only calm melody we had. This time, instead of treating it as something to be developed, it will go towards some kind of climax. Quite harsh dissonances. But this time he chooses not to pursue the dramatic angle, and after these 4 outbursts, he goes back to pianissimo, just a single voice. And the very final coda. It starts as if it's the beginning of the movement. But note the slight and very interesting difference. In the beginning, this is the first bar, which is the strong one, and this is the weak one, the second. Strong beat. And here, in the coda, he reverses the tables. It's strong, weak, strong. It's hard to explain exactly what the purpose of it is, but just it's another thing that he is not content with just repeating things. Even when he does repeat them, he still wants to vary it. And perhaps what he does achieve through this is a final burst of drive. This is quite proclamatory, whereas this is more, it pushes you towards something. It is not stable and content with being where it is. And then he builds on this and continues the next bars with the same motive twice as fast. So it was full bar, and now it will be half bars. And also in the left hand, instead of 8th note, he writes 16th note. Bringing us to the end of this magnificent first movement, which is symphonic and orchestral and just bursting out with melodic invention and energy. I find it wonderful. And he gives us then one of the most beautiful second movements he's written, not just in his early period, but from any time, in my opinion. He writes it in a somewhat unusual key for a sonata in E flat major. It is C major. And you might remember we encountered C major already before in the exposition. After this dramatic moment, he went to C major here. So the seed of C major has already been planted, and in fact for Beethoven this relationship between C major and E flat major is something that he explores in a few other works as well, particularly in one of the violin sonatas which he was to write soon after, from Opus 12. But for me the main point here is the great contrast between this golden glow of the E flat major. If you think it's the key associated also with the Emperor Concerto. This kind of really golden sound. And C major. C major as a key, if you think, it can be quite plain, it can be neutral, but in Beethoven's hands it can also be a key of great depth and lyricism and profound beauty. And the biggest example I can give is the last movement of his last sonata, number 32. And it is very close in mood to the beginning of the second movement here. I would bet that for any of us discovering this sonata for the first time, reading this or hearing this for the first time is a revelation. It is a moment where you think, how could this music exist without us knowing it? At least this was the case for me. He writes these short phrases, hesitating, questioning, and then long pauses. The pauses almost as eloquent as if they were part of the music. Very deep, stable chords, low in the keyboard. And now the big surprise. Isn't that beautiful? And then, even bigger surprise, sforzando and going to this harmony. This being the lowest note he could reach on his keyboard, so he really wants to root it as deeply as he can. Then the movement does begin to go upwards a bit. This kind of note is like a moment of light after the rich but quite dark colors here. And even higher. I will not go over every section because then this video will be interminably long, but just to point out a few other interesting moments here. The middle section of this movement is, we went from a key with flats, E flat major, to a key without flats or sharps, C major, and then he goes back to a key with flats for the middle section. To this warm, rounded sound of A flat major. A kind of texture that he really likes, long chords in the right hand. You probably hear how everything is so rich, it's always full chords. It is something that we had also in the first movement, very full, thick chords, melodies in octaves. It's like he's not content anymore with just one note for the melody and a few notes in the left hand. He wants an orchestral sound. So once again, this idea of, is this pianistic or is this orchestral, or is this trying to make the piano sound greater than what it could be at the time, or him effectively expanding on what the piano could sound like. And the accompaniment here, like a bassoon or strings pizzicato, I think bassoon. And together. The second movement is quite dramatic. It has moments of real tension. It has lots of sforzandi in various places, strong accents. One moment to show is here. After this section comes to an end, he has these empty octaves. And then, like a forlorn reply in pianissimo. This is so full of imagination. We can imagine it almost like an operatic scene, something very strong, be it fate or whatever. And then the lone soul far away. And now, speaking about orchestral thinking, he writes piano, crescendo on the note, sforzando, which of course is an unplayable effect. We cannot make a crescendo on one note on the piano. Once we struck it, it just decays, it never goes up. But with strings or woodwinds, that kind of effect can be very easily achieved. So at least in terms of imagination, he was imagining a kind of roar coming from this. But then the darkness and drama has passed. And he repeats the main theme in the highest reaches of the keyboard. And then later, this is what brings us to the reprise. This is also remarkable. He here writes the lowest notes he has. And here he writes the highest notes he has. So it is effectively as far apart, the dramatic contrast, as he could have made it at the time. After the reprise, there is a really beautiful coda. For me, it's one of the most exquisitely, lyrically beautiful places Beethoven has written. The melody will be in the tenor. This yearning, this striving upwards. And now, like a pulse of a clock, and this is our goodbye scene. Him planting this A flat already before, so we had it here, and then here, and now here. Instead of, we have, so it's something, I don't know if painful, but again a kind of darker color which makes the palette so much richer. And then at the very end, the dark colors with this chromaticism returns. So he repeats the melody. We have but very different harmonies. And again the A flat. Sforzando in a fortissimo. Thus ending the second movement. That's a movement I could play endlessly, really. The third and the fourth movement are perhaps less revolutionary and perhaps slightly more conventional. This is not a bad thing to say, it's just that there was so much innovation in the first two movements that perhaps he felt it was too much, I don't know. There's enough interesting stuff in the last two movements, definitely, but it does feel a little bit for me of a sonata of two parts. The first and second movement are in one kind of world, with the third and fourth saying, well, we've shocked you enough, let's make it a little bit more palatable, more acceptable, more pleasant. Once again, this is not a criticism, it's just for me a different feeling, even on stage, playing these movements or working on them, coming from the last two movements and the first two. So the third movement, he doesn't write whether it's a scherzo or a minuet, he just writes allegro. It is somewhere in between, a scherzo minuet hybrid. It is utterly lovely, beautiful, so elegant, so comforting as well, and it has quite a bit of humor. This kind of wonderful timing which Beethoven knew how to do. He says something, then he pauses with a twinkle in his eye, looks at us, then says something else, pauses again, and then continues. But as you could hear from this is once again, it is a little bit more chamber in character. It doesn't feel nearly as symphonic as the first movements. The most exceptional thing in the third movement is the middle section. He goes from E flat major to E flat minor, which is quite a rare key. At the time it has 6 flats. It's unusual, but it is a key which Beethoven has already used when he was 14 years old. He wrote a piano quartet in E flat major, and there's also an E flat minor movement full of nearly demonic drive. And this love to deep flat keys with many flats, is something which we'll see later on also. If you think the Funeral March from Sonata number 12 in A flat minor. And I didn't mention, but in the first movement there was a section in C flat major, which is even more rare than E flat minor. It is a key with 7 flats. And as I read, in the finale there is a section in E major, which, fine, it's a key with sharps, but in his original version he wrote it as F flat major, which is a key with 8 flats, which nobody uses, and even he decided not to use it because it would be just almost, well, I won't say absurd, but it would be very extreme, and he decided to enharmonically change it to E major. But interesting how his thinking works: flats, 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 more flats, E flat minor, 6 flats, C flat major, 7 flats, and originally F flat major, a key with 8 flats. The minore, however, it does have drive, but it is more of a tremble rather than a drive. I don't know, is this an Aeolian harp or a regular harp, or just something passing on the strings, whatever these strings they be. It is pianissimo, it is hushed, it is very atmospheric, and once again it has this idea of a loud note out of which things come. But remember we spoke about this, coming out of the loud long note, So here he has a sforzando in fortissimo, out of which the remaining two bars come. After the second section, which goes to quite a dramatic fortissimo climax, and then he writes the most atmospheric and memorable moment of all, a coda in pianissimo, which is so empty and hollow, and above it something really personal. Triple piano, going back to the movement itself. For me, this moment, it is so unexpected and so comes out of nowhere and so personal. I find it very, very strong. The finale is a very long rondo after this very long sonata. Beautiful and lovely and elegant. He writes poco allegretto e grazioso, so it has nothing of the drive and energy of the first movement. If anything, it is much more relaxed. So yes, we have this pulsation, which is a distant relative of this pulsation, but what a difference between the and it is constantly not in the home key, so we are in E flat major, but he writes it all on the dominant harmony. So he starts already with a question, and we only really reach a resolution in bar 8. Here. An interesting part of the refrain, it is a rondo form, so this music will come back several times, is that after all this elegance, he writes all of a sudden there's a small outburst in octaves, forte, sforzando, and he stops there. There's a fermata. It's like a statement. And then it's really interesting to see how he will go to different places from this fermata during the movement. So the first time he just repeats the same melody in the upper part of the keyboard. Then the first episode is quite in the same mood, and the second time we have this idea of stopping on this note. But now instead of going, we'll have some drama. So, a magnificent idea. He takes this octave, goes chromatically up, which becomes then the dominant of C minor. And once again, he writes a crescendo on this octave. This is in piano. Crescendo, sforzando, and fortissimo. Once again, this unplayable crescendo, which we cannot do on the piano, and this idea that there's a roar of sound coming from the imaginary orchestra, and we just need to simulate it somehow to indicate to the audience that there's a crescendo here. And now the most virtuosic bit of the finale. He has this passage in demi-semiquavers, 30-second notes. And then it will also pass to the right hand. This is very finger breaking. It is not comfortable, and you always have to find good fingerings to make this work. This is a passage which is fine for the left hand, but once you take it to the right hand, it is not very comfortable. And because it is effectively twice as fast as the main tempo, this is being 30-second notes, that's a passage which needs quite a bit of work in both hands. Then we have the refrain again and a repeat of the first episode in a different key. And then another magical moment. We have a fourth refrain, this time quite high up. Well, it is as high as it could. And where will he go this time here? So once we had this, and the third time, in the third refrain, it was the same as in the first time. And now we have the fourth time. He doesn't do it short. And we think, will he go here again? No, he just stays there. This is pure magic. He has gone to a key which couldn't be farther away. This is the moment, by the way, where I mentioned that he wrote something in E major, and originally this was C flat major. That is the moment. But effectively it is E major, so it's like, in today's terms, we would have, in a cinematic treatment of this sonata, we would have switched completely the color grading from warm and color which couldn't have been farther apart. So where do we go from here? He just uses an enharmonic chord and goes immediately back to the home key. So this passage is 6.5 bars long, but I can wager that this is one of the most memorable moments of the sonata, perhaps, if not just of this movement. And it's wonderful how he introduces this not as a main idea, but almost like an afterthought, saying, I can never stop to innovate and to try to surprise you and delight you. And then after this delight, we have the coda, and here another wonderful thing happens. If you think of concerti or symphonies, they're all ending in a big, loud way. Here, however, he says, actually, we had already our incredible drive, we had our drama, we had our poetry and beauty, and now it's just time to say goodbye, and he does it softly. Interestingly, this idea, it is related to the very dramatic, so it is also 30-second notes, but here they are relaxed like a little rivulet or brook flowing under the melody. There's a little bit of a build-up. Once again, it calms down, and this is the final goodbye. No ritenuto, just evaporating, and thus ending this magnificent sonata, which, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I think deserves to be played a lot more and is really worthy of our love, attention, and enjoyment.
you.